My thoughts this morning, over the last few days, I've just had I don't want to say a feeling of, but the thoughts of the feeling of hopelessness, and the the way that hopelessness pulls us away from peace and pulls us away from God Himself. And I started thinking about different examples in Scripture of individuals with hopelessness and how that can apply to us in our lives. And then I'd like to hopefully get away from the hopelessness and into hope. The first example that crossed my mind was doubt, and how that doubt brings us hopelessness. And in thinking of that, thought of John the Baptist. And as I look at these examples that I bring out here, I hope that we can see that we can get past the example and where the end is. And John the Baptist, as he's imprisoned, and he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, "Art thou the one that we look for, or shall we look for another?" There's a little bit of doubt that comes upon John the Baptist, and when we look at the example of John the Baptist in doubt, and we are able to see that John the Baptist baptized Jesus Christ in the Jordan River. And when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, there was a spirit that descended down upon Christ like a dove, and the voice of God that said, "Thou art my Son, in whom I am well pleased." John the Baptist was able to see that and be able to understand that this was the Christ. This was the one that he looked for. He was the forerunner to Jesus Christ. And so as he's in prison and he sends his disciples to Jesus and ask him again, just a little bit of doubt as he's nearing his deathbed, that he says, I just need to know before I die, art thou the one? Art thou the one? Art thou the one that I look for, or shall I look for another? We think about a doubt. Well, Thomas comes to mind. Thomas, the disciple of Christ that had spent much time with Jesus, and when his friends, his disciples, Jesus' disciples, come to Thomas and says that Christ is risen. He said, "Unless I place my hand into the nail prints in his hand and place where the Spirit went into his side, I shall not believe." Doubt. And Thomas is given by many he's the doubting disciple. Doubting Thomas is often given his name. We think about how that doubt had brought hopelessness to him. We think about how that as John in the prison, how that as he was doubting whether or not it was this the one, how there must have been just an emptiness that had come over him, a hopelessness of, as he's there in separated and unable to move forward. Thomas, I can just imagine that he had spent that time with Christ, and that he had set aside his life and followed Jesus, and then been able to see that he was crucified on the cross and he was buried in the grave, and that there was a doubt upon him that no, he cannot be alive. We think about Abraham and Sarah. You know, Abraham was up 100 years old and Sarah at 90. There had been some doubt that had come over Abraham about whether or not the promise that God had made him was going to come to pass. And he had went and sought his own way, and God comes to Abraham and says, no, Sarah is going to bear a child. And Abraham laughed. He laughed. He said, no. No. Not going to happen. You know, think about the doubt and how that doubt separates us from God. Whenever we doubt who God is and the separation that comes from that. The hopelessness that drives us. What about Gideon? You know, Gideon had told God had told Gideon that he was going to use Gideon to deliver Israel. And Gideon says, "If you're going to use me, I need a little bit of an example. If you're going to use me, why don't you turn this fleece and make the fleece wet and the ground dry?" That's a doubt. He says, "No, God, you can't use me. I think you've made a mistake, Lord." I tell you, the hopelessness that comes whenever we think about doubting. Think about what that does for us. How that separates us from seeing the Lord and seeing Him who He is. So doubting sometimes brings us hopelessness. What about loneliness? Loneliness sometimes leaves us feeling hopeless. You know, in times like this, whenever we're told that we've got to be separated from everyone, we're supposed to be socially distant. Well, what is loneliness? Is it not being socially distant, being away from those that you care about, away from those that you love? Loneliness brings sorrow to us and hopelessness. You know, whenever we don't have the strength of those around us, we don't have the strength of those that care for us, and we don't have the strength of just the encouragement of those that we love to carry us forward. Loneliness brings a hopeless feeling to us. I think Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, you know, when we read his writings through Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah, we find that he oftentimes just felt alone, left all by himself, that nobody cared to listen to what he had to say, and he lamented the feelings that he had upon us that came from his loneliness. You know, we think about guilt. Oftentimes brings hopelessness. And we think about David whenever I think about guilt. And we think about the time that he committed murder and adultery, and the guilt that poured into his heart, that he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, have mercy upon me." how hopeless he must have felt. Disobedience brings us hopelessness. So, man, Philip, you're being quite depressing this morning. I believe these are all things that we as children of God in this world have to deal with in our lives. Have to, we feel the burdens of, we think about Jonah. God told him to go to Nineveh. Told him to go and to preach to these heathens. And Jonas, he got on a ship and went the opposite direction and ran. Oh, disobedience brings hopelessness. As he was on that ship, and the storm come upon the ship, and the ship was about to be torn apart. And the men on that ship told Jonah, said, "Cry unto thy God, that he might save us." I tell you, the disobedience that was in the heart of Jonah as the storm was there about to send the whole ship into dismay. And Jonah says, "The only hope for you is that you cast me out into the sea." And I think about Jonah as he's cast overboard and he's swallowed up by this great fish. We think about how Jonah was spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. As he's there being in darkness, in hopelessness. I can imagine the thoughts that would go through the mind of Jonah as he's there, as he's spending that time, as there's nothing for him to do except to dwell on his disobedience, dwell on what into the position that he was. I think about Adam and Eve as we think about disobedience, and God had gave them one thing, not